The Economist prides itself on world-leading analysis and on the quality of its writing. Whether you're writing reports, emails, books or articles, our best-selling style guide is as essential as a dictionary, but in our opinion, more enlightening, educational and amusing. Lane Green is the paper's resident logophile. Yes, there's a term for a lover of words. He writes the Johnson column, which opines on the use and abuse of language.
If we throw around the word lie when we don't know the speaker's state of mind for sure, then we're weakening the word lie and its meaning. It's better to use other words like nonsense, exaggeration, untruth.
In a subscriber-only live event, Lane and Anton Lagardia, The Economist's digital editor, discuss the do's and don'ts of writing with clarity, flair and humour.
Hello and welcome to another subscriber-only live event with The Economist. I'm Anton Laguardia, the digital editor, and I'm joined by Lane Green, our language columnist. His column is called Johnson for regular readers of The Economist. This webinar will be covering The Economist's philosophy of language, the principles that underpin its style guide, and what we think makes good and bad writing. Well, the overriding goal of The Economist style is clarity. That before style or before showing off, that comes before showing off, before style or any other purpose. You're writing prose, not poetry. That is actually something that most people can learn to do and learn to do well, given enough advice, help, and practice. In the top of the Economist Style Guide, we have George Orwell's 6 famous rules for writing. They're taken from a 1946 essay that George Orwell wrote. And to discuss that with me is Lane Green, our Johnson columnist. Lane, why don't you take us through Orwell's? I'm going to call them Lane's 6 rules, but I'm sure there are Lane's 6 rules. But let's do George Orwell's 6 rules.
Right. Well, these are the rules that underpin our philosophy of language, if you like, and they're not unique to us. As we said, we borrowed them and put them straight from Orwell's essay into our style guide because I think they really stand the test of time and they work for really all kinds of different writing and not just journalism, but so many other kinds. The first one is never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech, which you're used to seeing in print. And this is a real tough one for a lot of journalists. We're writing on deadline. I think for daily journalists, I really have even more sympathy because you don't have a long time to come up with some of the beautiful metaphors and similes that Orwell did. If you read this essay, Politics in the English Language, it's got some absolutely unforgettable figures of speech in it. But this is back in the days in the 1940s where you probably had months to work on drafts of an essay and go back and forth and edits. Now we have newspaper pieces in the next day. We have digital pieces online the same day. But newspaper copy is filled with deer in the headlights or inflection points, things rising to a crescendo, although a crescendo is itself a rise. You can see how things just get imitated. You get high water marks or points of no return. During the pandemic, we've been talking about nothing is going to be a silver bullet or a magic bullet or a panacea. And our style guide actually says very nicely, if you do discover a panacea, please let the world know. That's something that will cure all things. But of course, nothing is a panacea. So saying this is not a panacea is the kind of the height of obviousness. The second rule is never use a long word where a short one will do. In Orwell's essay, he really talks a lot about the kind of Greek and Latin words that were kind of long a hallmark of educated English style. A lot of these were coined in about the 1600s, the early modern English period, where English was considered kind of insufficient to the task of learning and serious stuff. And so a lot of Greek and Latin words were coined and brought into English. But as a result, you get lots of unnecessary length and kind of pomposity. And even when you're not using a very fancy Greek word, you often hear people saying things like obtain when they mean get, or permit for let. People try to say, I saw an individual walking down the street rather than I saw someone or a person walking down the street. We acquire things instead of buying them. And in these pairs, the shorter word is almost always the Anglo-Saxon one. It goes back to the oldest kind of Germanic layer of the English language, rather than being a more recent Norman French, Latin, Greek, or other kind of borrowing. Not always, but very frequently. So we say pick that word that you would use in ordinary conversation, like let or get instead of permit or obtain. And if you do that in your writing, it'll feel more genuine. It'll feel more conversational. The third rule is if it's possible to cut a word out, always cut it out. There are wags who've noticed that you can cut the word out of this sentence twice. Compression of language really gives it a lot of vigor and sort of just kind of energy. Extra words kind of slow you down. It slows the reader down, it slows the writer down, and it slows the flow of your argument. So I have a personal rule, might go on my list of 6 little rules, of no matter how you're feeling about your draft when you're near the end, try to cut about 10% of your word count. And you'll find little repetitions. You'll find adjectives that don't add a lot, or adverbs that feel like, they could be subsumed by a better verb that sort of carries the adverb in it. And if you really try to compress as though you were trying to meet a word count that's 10% less than what you got, you'll just have so much more kind of flow to your writing. Never use the passive when you can use the active voice, Orwell says, and scholars of his essay have pointed out it has an unnecessary passive in the very first sentence. So I hope viewers of this webinar will look up the essay and read it. It is an excellent read. But in that very first sentence, he says, most people who bother with a matter at all would admit that the English language is in a bad way, but it is generally assumed that we cannot, by conscious action, do anything about it. That it is generally assumed is passive, and you can say people generally assume, or one generally assumes, or they generally assume. But he puts that in the passive instead. So we all use the passive sometimes, but it's best to keep things in the active. One reason is that it keeps you from obscuring the agent who did the thing in the sentence. Passives let you get away with sentences like Ronald Reagan's famous "mistakes were made." He doesn't say who made the mistakes. He simply says mistakes were made. And if you use the passive, you can admit who made the mistakes. And the other thing about the passive, it just has the feel of very often bureaucratic or academic prose. This is not to criticize our friends in the civil service or in academia, but the worst of prose from those fields can often make it feel like nobody's actually doing anything. This research project was performed, the results were analyzed, and so on and so on. Instead of saying we performed this experiment, we analyzed the results, we found. And it takes the humanity out of writing. And most people are interested in human beings, so they like seeing figures, characters, actors in your writing. The fifth rule is never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. This is a little bit like our short versus long rule above. Orwell wrote about political buzzwords and the sort of at his time, for example, the catchphrases of the Marxists that he had a falling out with and things like that. But today, if he were writing, I have a strong feeling he would also have singled out business writing, the kind of jargon where you hear learnings instead of lessons. Academic vogue jargon is still a problem as it was in his time. You hear lots of words like to trouble some narrative or to problematize something, and it feels cliquish and insiderish. Sometimes insider language is a good thing, but if you're aiming for a broad audience, you want to use the words that everybody uses and not the language of only your clique. And then finally, Orwell gives himself a bit of a get out of jail free card and says break any of these rules sooner than say anything outright barbarous. I've mentioned that Orwell breaks all these rules himself in his essay, even in the very first sentence, even in the phrasing of one of his rules. So if I were rephrasing his rules, I would say that a good rule of thumb is to do all 6 of these things, to bear them in mind, have them at your elbow, but don't treat them as always or never. Rather, treat them as good to have, very good to bear in mind at all times. So that's my tour through Orwell's 6 rules. But Anton, what are on your 6 rules? Or you can give us 4 or 3 or 7 if you must. But what do you think makes for good writing? What do you try to keep in mind when you are writing?
Well, I have the grandmother's rule, which is that when you're trying to write about something, particularly if it's a bit complicated, have your grandmother or your grandfather in mind, and try to explain to them in a sentence or at most two, what is the story about? Why is it interesting? Why should you care about this interesting thing that I've gone out to report on, or this very important report I've just read? And so how would you summarize it? And it's the kind of thing that you would go home and says, can you believe that? I don't know. The rate of domestic abuse goes up after football matches in this country, or whatever it is that strikes you as interesting, and you would go home and tell people about. So try and bear that in mind. That is likely to be the most interesting and salient point, or at least a good hook to bring people into your story. Then I think the other rule is that be aware that you are writing prose, not poetry. You don't have to be a master of the English language. You don't have to be Shakespeare. You just have to communicate effectively and clearly. And typically keeping sentences simple, keeping structure simple, avoiding lots of cliches, gets you 2/3 of the way to extremely competent copy. And there are a lot of journalists who don't do that and have to be reminded of that basic, simple fact. And the last thing I think I would say is, at the end of a piece of writing, take a moment. That's assuming you've written it in time for your deadline. Take a moment, take a breather, come back and read it aloud, and that will force you to hear it as a stranger would, as a person who hasn't written the piece. And you would be amazed at how often what you think you've written is not what you've actually written, because you know in your head what you're trying to say, but your fingers haven't necessarily done that thing that your head wants to do. So put it aside, forget it for a moment, then read it aloud. And if you trip over anything, you stumble over anything, something doesn't quite make sense, go back and fix it.
I like those rules. For those of you whose grandmothers are nuclear physicists or Nobel Prize winners, or grandfathers for that matter, my grandfather was the guy who got me into this language loving thing. He was an army chemist. It can be anybody. I like to think of an intelligent friend or one's own brother, mother, but it can be anybody who's intelligent but doesn't know what you know.
So Lane, you write a language column, which is well read. And you're also one of a group of people who help to compile, maintain, update the style guide. How do you think of the purpose of a style guide in a news organization?
Well, it does a couple of things. Some of them are rather unsexy, but they're really important. For example, a style guide is about consistency. So a lot of people confuse the issues of grammar and style and think that everything that's in the Economist style guide is a sort of macro rule of the English language that can't be broken, but that's false. For example, close up email. We don't write it with a hyphen, but you can write it with a hyphen. You haven't done anything wrong. Readers would get confused or annoyed if we wrote it with a hyphen and then 2 sentences later without a hyphen. So consistency is really important. And sometimes you make rulings on issues that really don't have a right or wrong, but are just a preference. It also gives your style or publication avoid. For example, lowercase a lot of things. We write Second World War lowercase. We write Cold War lowercase. And in general, The Economist lowercase is a lot more things, the Queen, the Pope, than a lot of other publications do. And I think it gives our prose a certain look and feel and voice. And these more philosophical rules, don't use jargon, use Anglo-Saxon words, use short words, use common words. That also gives us that conversational feel that I like to think we're known for, and has become part of our brand. So it's really about giving an organization not just the nitty gritty that they need, all the detailed rulings on how to spell Gaddafi, which can be spelled about 47 different ways. It's also giving them a sort of sense of purpose. It's kind of like a mission statement. I hate that word, but another piece of business jargon, but it's kind of like a mission statement for your language.
T. Lawrence was, when he wrote Seven Pillars of Wisdom, received a note from his publisher saying, you've written these places in many different ways. This is against the standard Foreign Office transliteration of Arabic place names. And he wrote back saying, I write my words any which way I want to show what a rot all systems are for transliteration. Tell me, I guess one of the questions that a style guide compiler has to contend with is when to resist change and when to accept it.
Right.
Lots of
That's
words change, language changes. If you read a Dickens novel, people don't write like that today. Um, so to what degree should a newspaper style guide ride with the times, and when should it try and hold back the tide?
I think that's a great question, and I think it's another slightly philosophical question, which is to say you can decide, you can imagine kind of a little slider that goes from conservative and relatively slow to adopt changes in the language to highly innovative and up to the minute using the latest kids slang. I wrote a column a couple of years ago about the book written by the copy chief for BuzzFeed. And BuzzFeed is, you can imagine The Economist almost at one end of the scale, not the very most conservative end, but towards the conservative end. We are not trying to sound like Twitter, and we're definitely not trying to sound like BuzzFeed. So I like to think of it as a classic style where we'll be one of the late adopters to linguistic innovation. And at the other end, you'd have the BuzzFeeds. That's the people who are saying meh, MEH in the body copy of a piece of writing, something we would never really do. So we're slow to take on changes, but if you don't change some, you will die. The only languages that don't change are dead languages. Classical Latin doesn't really change because it can't, because its speakers are dead. It did change, by the way. It turned into French and Spanish and Portuguese and Romanian. So that's what happened living for 2 years. It changed completely and utterly. But in language is the only one that doesn't change of its own accord. Just lots of small changes in the language accumulate. Given enough time, you get a completely different language. So we don't try to do the very latest and greatest in slang. I think our readers would probably get annoyed by that. It's okay to set your settings at be slightly conservative, but you do need to change. And we can talk about some of the changes in our style guide if you like.
I think that's right. I think it's okay to be slightly behind the times. People understand what you're writing about, and it means that your style isn't constantly changing with the latest fad. Then again, we do need to change things, and we have changed the style guide, over time. If you're to look back over the past 2 or 3 years, what would you say are the main changes that we've made?
All right. Well, there's a couple of changes we've made because the times have changed a bit, if you like. An example that I think it's worth mentioning in a bit of detail is allowing the use of singular they in sentences like everyone has their own opinion or something like that. People often think of this as modern political correctness gone amok, and that now we're kowtowing to feminists rather than using the good old-fashioned everyone has his own opinion in this sort of early modern view that he includes she in sentences like that. Now, it's true that for the last several hundred years, that's been a relatively common view, that he includes she, and that you can say everyone has his own opinion and mean the ladies as well. But interestingly, when the suffragettes challenged the voter laws, saying that the voter was referred to with the generic he, and therefore they were obviously allowed to vote because of this rule, they were told, no, in this case, it definitely doesn't include the ladies, because that would be absurd, right, letting the women vote. So this rule has always had a questionable status, and it also is questionable from psycholinguistics. We know that if you say, like, every professor should meet with his students once a week after hours, people envision a male professor. If you mention a generic but use he, you get a man in your mind, naturally. So he is not truly generic. But we made a conservative argument for changing to things like every professor should meet with their students once a week. And that is that the so-called singular they is hundreds and hundreds of years older than people realize. It goes back at least to 1375, the oldest citation of it in the Oxford English Dictionary. So that puts us well into the Middle English period. It is in Shakespeare. It is in the King James Bible in several places. It is in Jane Austen all over the place. This has been around forever. It's never disappeared from use. It's in, kind of vigorous use. And it's basically what everybody says. For example, if someone leaves their umbrella on the table and the rest of the table leaves for dinner, you say, oh, somebody left their umbrella. I just said someone left their umbrella naturally because that's what everyone says. You wouldn't say, oh, someone left his umbrella when the dinner table was 8 women and 2 men. That would be absurd. We all realize that would be absurd. And someone left his or her umbrella just sounds a little weird in a restaurant with your friends. So they is venerable. It has a literary tradition. It is inclusive, but it's hardly innovative. And so it's a really nice traditional response to a little gap in the English language where we don't have a possessive pronoun that means both his and her. There is plural, but people don't really have a problem processing this. You is also plural and singular. So finally, about 2 or 3 years ago, we said, in cases where you can't get around it, can't write around it, go ahead and use the singular they. And I think it was a good decision. I wrote a column about it at the time. And I've seen it in our pages a few times, and I've never seen an angry letter. If we get one, I would tell those letter writers the same thing I've told you, which is it's a surprisingly conservative solution.
Thank you. I think we should open this up to the floor and turn to some questions that people have sent in. We've been getting questions in recent days, and they're still coming in. So let me try and pick up on some of those and see what we make of them. First of all, the various questions that I've grouped into the rubric of kind of how the Economist does things. And one of the things that comes up is a single voice of the Economist. Steve asks, I love that the Economist is written without credits because it makes it sound like one voice. Why do you do this? Why not credit the journalist? Well, we are unusual in that we do maintain anonymity of people who've written articles, and we kind of like it that way. It is fraying around the edges. If you go on Twitter, you will see Economist journalists tweeting in their own name and tweeting which stories are theirs. You will see newsletters that are sent out in the name of particular journalists. So we're starting to remove the mask slightly, but I think it still creates a kind of sense, a collegiate sense in the paper. Stories are often seen by many people, subject matter experts. If people write about economics, they might show their story to economics experts. We often do it with science, where we circulate pieces about climate change to make sure that we're accurate on the science. And the editing process is very collective. It goes through many, many layers of editors. So in a sense, the finished article is, in a way, the voice of the paper and the collective wisdom of the paper. Then Linda and Robert ask us questions about quality control, really. Well, that's the tag I've given it. I'm interested to know what review and quality control processes you have in place that enable you to maintain the state of almost perfection. Well, thank you, Linda. We see lots of imperfections, but the adherence to the style guide, the experience of editors, and the fact that lots of them see stories helps maintain that quality, and of course the quality of the original journalism. But mistakes do still get through. You'd be amazed at how many things are seen by how many pairs of eyes, and yet spelling mistakes get through. Robert says, in previous years, The Economist maintained a standard of English well beyond most publications, but in the last couple of years, I see more and more such nasties as comprised of, and in the most recent issue, led, L-E-A-D, instead of led, L-E-D, as a past participle of the verb to lead. As an editor, I've wondered if this is just a form of saving money by having fewer editors and proofreaders, or are your proofers less well educated than they used to be? Is that a bit harsh, Lane? What do you think?
On lead, L-E-A-D, for the past tense of lead, L-E-A-D, guilty as charged. There's nothing you can do to cop to that one and say that is wrong. We haven't cut proofreaders or sub-editors. As far as I know, the process is exactly the same as it has always been. It's a little tougher in the pandemic. We are working almost entirely from home, and we were entirely at home. And I think people started noticing a few more typos getting through, merely because we're circulating PDFs rather than paper proofs, and a lot of things got a bit more difficult. Now, comprised of is one of those legitimately contestable rules. Originally, so-and-so, the United States comprises 50 states is the traditional, is comprised of, bothers a lot of people. There's even one guy who has corrected this out of around 30,000 Wikipedia articles. This was as of about 5 years ago, so if he's still at it, he's probably done 100,000 by now. But so a lot of people feel that is comprised of is wrong. It's actually in the federal codes, in the U.S. federal code, the body of law of the United States. It appears several thousand times. It goes far back. It has, a pretty strong literary pedigree of its own. If you want to be safe, comprises is the better choice, but is comprised of is so common in educated, edited, and official prose. I think it's achieved a kind of quasi-official status too. So I put that in a slightly different category of disputed rule rather than unambiguously wrong, as in the first case.
Thank you. Edward asks whether one should stick to the most simple language and whether it diminishes standards of spoken and written English. What's your advice on brevity to keep and how to keep stories short and punchy?
For me?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I like a rule. I didn't get to mention this in Lane's 6 little rules. I don't know if I have 6, but one of them really is break up your longest sentences every chance you get. If you have written your piece, besides doing that, cut 10% of the word count I mentioned, find your 3 longest sentences and consider breaking them each into at least 2 pieces. So it will remove, and reading aloud, by the way, your tip, which is an excellent one, will also find those clunky sentences that don't flow. And if you read them, you will find them yourself. You'll say, that sentence just doesn't work. I couldn't read it aloud easily and fluidly. And definitely break those sentences up. But if you wrote only in short staccato as subject, verb, object kind of sentences all the time, and you only use the very most basic vocabulary all the time, it would start to get a little bit weird. So again, with the always and nevers, don't apply any rule always or never, but rather consider short sentences and straightforward vocabulary. But if you do that most of the time, that gives you the sort of space to indulge in a longer sentence that has a little bit more of an intricate structure. It allows you to use the odd $100 word that you love. And hopefully you use it in a context so that people who don't know it can figure it out. Or, every once in a while, sending someone to a dictionary is no crime. But as we started off saying here today, The Economist, we don't want to distract you and send you to a dictionary, even to an online dictionary. We want you reading The Economist. So ideally, we shouldn't be using words that people don't know. But it's okay to have some variety. If you don't vary your pace and sometimes your style and vocabulary, but it is going to get a bit samey, and we don't want to be samey.
Yes, I think it's right. The assumption should be that you should be writing in short sentences because it keeps them crisp. But you can indulge yourself every once in a while with a nice, long, sinewy one, as Mark Twain used to advise. Jen asks us at the other end, individuality. If you have a style guide, do you crush individuality? If you don't give people, writers, the full reign of their abilities.
What do you think about that? I was going to put this to you. I can think of some colleagues I can definitely identify from their prose. Not every one of them by any means, but we know our colleagues well enough, and we've read their stories and know who they are enough times that there are a few people whose style jumps out to me, and I can think of a couple in particular. What about you?
Yes, I think when you've seen enough of your colleagues' stories, even once they've gone through the Economist machine, you still identified. I think that, people write in many different ways, and there are many different ways of being effective. Some people write very colorfully. Some people write in very kind of didactic, clear style. I think as long as it works and it's effective, go for it. There are sort of indulgences, though, that when you come across, you say this really doesn't work, or it's a jumble of not only of half-dead metaphors, but a kind of concatenation of half-dead metaphors that is just terrible, and it just has to be cut back. There's a nice quote in our style guide which refers to a writer whose prose is like a diamond; it shines best when it's cut. We're asked about news versus analysis. Are we becoming newsier? I'm the digital editor, so it's my job to make sure that we have a daily cadence in what we offer, as well as the weekly cycle of the traditional print edition. And my ambition is that you shouldn't be able to tell the difference between a news analysis piece written as a digital-only story, as a print story. We aspire to the same standard. We have to get it out a bit faster, but it just means that our internal processes have to be quicker. There's sometimes a bit less time to think, but our journalists are extremely experienced and know their stuff and can bash out a very wise piece of analysis in a very short time.
One of the questions that comes up is, should we let news pieces run a little longer since we have print constraints? It's something that's come up in our editorial meetings many times. I don't know what, but you being the digital editor, do you feel like you should edit things to sort of print length, or is it good to allow the writer a little bit more space if they can get in some more detail, even at the expense of letting the average online piece be longer than the average print piece?
Well, you know, a proportion of our readers read us not on a phone on the tube or on an iPad, lying back on the couch. So you have to assume that people are quite busy. So you don't, one of the things that we do is say, we're going to summarize the world for you. We're going to tell you what's important, and we're not going to waste your time. We value your time, which is why you're subscribing to us. And therefore, I think, we on digital value conciseness, crispness, as much as everything else. It is true that having a print edition confines the space and therefore forces you to, turn the vice a bit harder on pieces. But if there's redundant material in a digital story, I will take it out. Very roughly in my mind, I think about 1,000 words is the longest pieces should be. But there are times when it's a big, meaty subject where we're going to give you an authoritative view on this, and therefore we'll let it run longer. So it depends on the subject matter. It depends on the context and the news. But we don't want to fill your reading with superfluous words. Gabriel asks us, and this is interesting, has writing style changed to accommodate the fact that articles will be available as a spoken word? As subscribers will know, a lot of the paper is available in audio form, in that we have readers who will read it out to you, rather as the storytellers in Cuban tobacco factories read out books to tobacco rollers. We have people who read out the paper. You can listen to it in your audio edition as you're going for a jog or commuting or traveling on a long haul flight when that is allowed. Does the writing style change? I don't think so. It is true that to write for audio and indeed to write for video is different, but we start with the written word as it's going to be read. We find that you can convey more information in prose. And then, when necessary, we'll adapt it to the other format. So it starts as the written word. We have an audio edition that reads it out to you. Keeping sentences simple helps with that. So there is a bit of overlap there, but we don't write for audio in the main body of the paper.
I can mention one of my favorites that I did a Christmas special. Christmas is when we get to write these longer pieces on something that just takes our intellectual fancy and isn't in the news. And I did a piece on the hardest language in the world. What is the hardest language in the world? Which is an excuse to look at a bunch of different languages that do very different things from how English does them, and explore how that would just be mind blowing if you had to learn one of these languages. And you can look up the article on the website. Just Google hardest language in the world, and you'll find it easily enough. But it led to the hardest ever pronunciation problems, I think, for our audio edition team, because they had to read out a Turkish word that had about 75 letters in it and was the equivalent of a whole English sentence, and it had things with tones and all kinds of crazy things that don't exist. And I also did one on Icelandic, also a Christmas special. I think that also flummoxed the audio edition team a little bit. So I like to make their life difficult by writing about weird languages.
I'm going to ask you the next one. There are various economist oddities, quirks of our own style that are there for no reason than the fact that that's the way we like it, and we think there are good reasons for it. One is data. We write data as plural. You will see in The Economist, the data suggest, the data tell us, the data are. How do you feel about the plural data? Most publications, I think, have turned it into a singular.
This is a hotly debated topic in the building. Even when you're not in the building, it comes up a lot, and we have some different opinions on it. In fact, I think it's a little bit generational too. The question I think is right in its premise that that this is changing, and you can Google the data are and the data is, or various combinations of plural and singular verb in a thing called the Google Ngram viewer. Look it up; it's a fantastic tool for looking at historical changes in English. It's N, the letter N, and then gram. And if you see that, you'll see that the data is, or singular use of data is on the rise. So it's clearly growing. I think it might be at about parity. And this is in books. So this is things that have been through heavily edited process. We know it's coming. There's sort of an underlying question of to what extent should you obey the rules of a foreign language or grammar when a word has been borrowed. If you buy a little toasted Italian sandwich about that thin, you might have bought a panini. This is an Italian plural, as you well know, Anton. And this is something most people don't walk into their Pret or wherever and order a panino. It is a panino in Italian, but it's not in English. So there's not a macro rule that says you have to follow the grammatical rules of another language. And we don't do that in lots of other ways. We have a candelabra, a agenda, stamina. There are lots of words in English that were originally plurals in another language, and you wouldn't dream of saying, these are my agenda today. So data is an outlier here because it's kind of hotly contested. We've set the slider to conservative, as I mentioned, and that's why we're still plural on it. It is the older, slightly more traditional usage, but you wouldn't embarrass yourself to say the data is, and it's not impossible that we'll change the rule one day.
And related to that, obviously, is whether you can anglicize a plural of Latin words, stadiums rather than stadia, referendums rather than referenda. Where do you come out on that?
Well, our style guide here just has a list of which ones are and which ones are ums. So we say referendums, but we say, I'd have to look at what are some of the us. But we have just a long list of 20 us and, ending with the letter A, and a long list of 20 or so ums. Which one sounds natural? I mean, forums feels more natural than fora. You'll see fora in academic prose, but we're not academic prose. So the ones that just feel usual and common, what have you heard around the pub? I mean, it's a good question to ask yourself sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these rules have to do with how long certain usages have been in common parlance, in common use, and eventually you have to bow to the times, and quite rightly so. Another one that comes up quite a lot: why do we persist? Edwin asks, why do we persist in referring to the United States as America when intending to refer to the political entity? Well, again, I think it's a matter of that's the way most people speak. Donald Trump said, "Make America great again." He didn't say, "Make the United States of America great again." In context where it's plain that we're referring to the United States, and we'll say America. In context where we might want to differentiate between the state and the American continent, particularly when it comes to stories about the Americas involving Canada, Central America, and Latin America, we will use the United States as well to refer to that. Lane, journalists do all this. At school, we're told not to start sentences with conjunctions and buts, but in journalism, we do it all the time. Are we making a terrible mistake for which we should all be wrapped over the knuckles?
I'm glad you asked. Who answered that? Who asked that question?
Paul,
thank you for the question, Paul. So I like to borrow a phrase. There's a writer on language I admire who came up with what he called the Big Three. This is Benjamin Dreyer, by the way, who came out with a nice style book of his own recently. But the Big Three language myths, the Big Three rules that you will have heard that you really should ignore are the following. One is don't start a sentence with a conjunction. It's simply not the case that you can't do that. I don't know where this rule comes from because throughout literature, throughout The Economist, throughout journalism, sentences start with a conjunction, and that's a perfectly fine thing to do. I'm speaking right here, so you could have put a period before me saying, and that's a perfectly natural thing to do, and it is, which is why people do it when they write. Conjunctions link things together, and they're very sensible things to put at the start of a sentence because it sort of expresses the relationship to the previous. You put a but there that implies some kind of contrast. I think the rule may originate in a sort of primary school kind of rule of right, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and they start every sentence with and. And so their teacher says, don't start every sentence with and. Guidance like that has a way of becoming simplified and then made absolute. So it becomes, for all writers, don't ever start a sentence with a conjunction. You can junk that rule. It's one of the big three. The number two of the big three, if you'll permit me, Anton, is the split infinitive. Can't put anything between and a verb. So to boldly go is supposedly a crime for many people. This was never a legitimate rule of the English language. People have been splitting infinitives since the Middle English period, since the 14th century. We have examples in every century from the 1400s on to today. The list of great writers who split infinitives is longer than you can imagine. But in about the 1800, very first decade of the 1800s, someone said, don't split an infinitive. And this rule caught on, so that for the last 200 years, people have been saying you can't say things like, she decided to gradually retire. But if you take the sentence, she decided to gradually retire, you can't move the gradually anywhere else without either making it wrong or making it ambiguous. Try it at home. And you'll see that there's often the very best place for a modifier to go is right before the verb. She decided to gradually retire. So we've junked that rule. We've said, we used to say, there's nothing wrong with splitting an infinitive, but don't do it anyway. And that was a bit of a, frankly, a way of not annoying a minority of readers who were wrong themselves on that topic. So we changed the rule and said, look, if you need to, split the infinitive. If you can't stand to, rework the whole sentence. Don't just badly unsplit the infinitive by moving your modifier one word. And the last of the big three, this one's probably the least controversial, is don't end a sentence with a preposition. Obviously, English allows you to do that all the time. People say things like, that's the guy I was talking to, not the guy with whom I was talking. It's been around since, again, it's probably 1,000 years old in English, and there's absolutely no reason not to do so. It's one of the three big myths. So those are three rules you can safely dispense with the official blessing of the economist.
So this is a moment to pause on the question of rules in language, which is to what extent should there be rules? To what extent were they created artificially? If all these forms were perfectly acceptable previously, why have these rules arrived and bound us so?
That's a great question. I mean, it gets a bit philosophical to talk about that. But in my view, if people, including great writers, were doing something before the rule was written, and then the rule was grafted on, but it hadn't been observed up to that point, then the rule was wrong from the very start. And that's the case with the split infinitive, and that's the case with don't end a sentence with the preposition, and that's the case with lots of other so-called fake rules. And so the rule was never really legitimate. But through repetition, a rule can start to become self-sustaining. It can kind of bootstrap itself into respectability, where people have heard the rule, they enforce the rule, like don't split an infinitive, until so many people have heard it and so many people have enforced it, including editors, that it starts to become a quasi-rule, even though it was wrong at the start. And I would argue that the split an infinitive has had a couple centuries run, something like that, where it was kind of hard to find them in edited prose because so many people had believed in this false rule. Well, what status do we give that kind of fake rule that kind of became almost a real rule? It's a tricky one. But if it makes you deform your sentences in an unnatural way, get rid of it. Be practical and say, this rule is doing more harm than good. No sentence is really harmed by a split infinitive ever. Some people don't like them, but you can't please everybody, and you're more often doing harm to your sentences. So I take a fairly pragmatic approach to that kind of question. But there's some deep issues there.
At this point, if we had a polling function, I would ask our viewers how they felt about the split infinitive. I suspect it would split along lines of age and probably down the Atlantic, where British writers dislike it more than American ones. So folks, Star Trek was right to boldly go where no man has gone before is correct, not incorrect. Japanese names. So we write about the world here. We write about the whole world. And there are all kinds of questions about how to refer to people's jobs, how, the Italian prime minister is actually the president of the Council of Ministers, but we shorten it to prime minister. And there's a question here about Japanese names. A few years back, The Economist changed its house style for Japanese names from Shinzo Abe to Abe Shinzo. I'd love to know more about how The Economist makes choices about the proper names. How do you decide to almost always refer to Yoko Widodo as Jokowi and other subsequent mentions. Well, I think again here the rule is how do speakers of the language use themselves? How do the people refer to themselves? Shinzo Abe was an anglicization of the Japanese form of names, where the surname came first and the name came after. And the Japanese, I think, government made it a rule that they were changing back in their English translations. So we decided to follow suit, but it is something that was lurking in the minds of our Japanese speakers anyway. We do it with Chinese. So it felt like high time we made the change, but it does mean that we're different to most English language publications. On Jokowi, the rule is that we'll usually use his full name on first mention. We'll say that he's usually known as Jokowi, and then we might subsequently use that. One of the advantages there is that it saves you a word every time you mention him. And a saved word can mean a saved line, which can mean a saved paragraph, which means you can write lots of other things. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, in some papers is Benjamin Netanyahu, has been anglicized. In other papers, in other forums, it's Bibi. Everyone knows him as Bibi. His supporters call him Bibi. So again, we do the same thing. We will mention his first name. We'll say Benjamin Netanyahu, and then we will say known as Bibi, and then often we will use Bibi subsequently. Okay, so metaphors comes up quite a lot. There was a time when I used to send the memo to the paper that would give style advice to people, and we always had a sort of horrible mixed metaphors. So Nicholas asks, what's wrong with a metaphor, e.g., silver bullet, if it conveys a concise and clear information to the reader? The advice against it seems to be putting style before clarity.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good point. I mean, again, with the always never versus try to bear in mind, any edition of The Economist that you go through will have some familiar metaphors and fixed phrases in it. So we don't hold ourselves to this advice all the time. I think the reason, I know the reason, because he explained his thinking very well, that Orwell warned against metaphors that you've heard a million times, is that it allows you to kind of write on autopilot. And if you're just stringing together phrases that you've seen a million times, it makes the writing almost like a machine is doing it. Now we have machines that indeed do exactly that, and they can sometimes do a plausible passing for English style. But they're purely imitative, and we don't want to do that. We want to be thinking as we write. And so if you enforce a strict ban on cliches, then it makes you think really hard about what you want to say and how you would convey it most freshly and originally. The other case against metaphors that are familiar is they just lack punch. Inflation will just reduce the value of anything. And if you heard something a million times, you stop thinking about it because it's not fresh. The first person to say the 800-pound gorilla was original, and that was striking and probably engaged his listeners or readers. But the 1,000th or the 100,000th person to say it is just kind of repeating a clapped out phrase. So it can tire your readers or lull them to sleep, and it can make you write in an autopilot way that you don't want to be. So those are the best arguments against, but you will find phrases for it. So silver bullets and see in our pages. So when you do, we will have either not taken our advice, or we will have decided maybe this time it was the right thing to do.
I mean, I think the 2 points of advice there. One is that overuse deadens your prose, and people stop hearing it. The other thing is that a lot of people who use metaphors don't even know their metaphors. They've forgotten their metaphors, so they tend to string them along. I used to keep a list of mixed metaphors I came across. I've got one here. Projects announced today could kick in as the economy is rebounding on its own steam, leading to overheating. I don't know what that sentence means, and I've kind of stopped paying attention to it by the time I've got to the end of it. So one of the points about reading a sentence aloud is that you hear what is actually a metaphor or a cliche, and you might stop yourself from using it. If it's something that you've heard before 1,000 times, at the very least, try to think of a better way of putting it, or a different form of words. Invent your own metaphor. The world will be grateful to you for inventing a new turn of phrase. Here's a tricky one: foul language. People in everyday speech swear a lot. A lot of people detest it. At the Telegraph, when I worked there many years ago, we had a rule that we weren't allowed to use swear words in copy, unless and only if a judge had heard it. So if it was in the context of a court report and a defendant used a particularly vile word, or a policeman read out a quote from his or her notebook, then it could be reproduced on the third page of the Telegraph. Otherwise, we weren't allowed to use it. At The Economist, we're a bit laxer with that rule, but where do you think we should come down on foul language? This is a question that Daniel asked.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. That's a great question. We do a little soul searching about this. But, I mean, one rule is don't shock or offend for no reason. So obviously, we don't want to do that. And our style book does say, don't sprinkle your prose with blue words because you want to get a sort of schoolboy giggle out of doing so. Neither in your own copy nor unnecessarily in quotes. But I've written several times to the effect that where it is part of an important news story, when an incredibly important figure, for example, the previous president of the United States, used a swear word, it was important to print it. And our style guide says if we do so, and if it is newsworthy, then do so without asterisks or dash, 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 or anything like that. And I wrote a more recent column specifically on the issue of shocking slurs, racist abuse, most famously the issue of the N-word, which I'm not going to say aloud here because it, as an American, it sort of shocks me to my core to say, to hear. But when about a year ago, 2 North Carolina policemen used this word viciously on a recording, they didn't know they were being recorded. They said, we're going to go out and start slaughtering those Fucking-niggers. The most horrible thing you can imagine a police officer on duty saying. Now, that story was reported in the New York Times, and it was saying it sits in that going on to use an expletive and a racial slur. To me, that simply does not convey the shock that the reader should feel on knowing that these policemen said what they said. And it gives me zero pleasure to convey that shock, but it's not the journalist's job to soften shock. Because we have to report on shocking things, wars and crimes against humanity and racist violence and all kinds of other awful things. And if you don't want to know about those things, you need to close your newspaper for a little while because it can be heavy going. And there can be an emotional toll to reading lots of bad news. So we don't do it deliberately. We don't do it to shock. But news like that story in North Carolina should shock. And if you haven't been shocked by the story, then that story wasn't written right.
From the distressing and the foul to the entertaining. Puns. Carol asked, do you have a designated punster? How do you come up with them, and how long does it take to create them? Well, I think the answer to that is everybody tries to come up with a good pun. There are some fabulous ones. And there are kind of flashes of inspiration by the section editor, usually. Sometimes the correspondents themselves will send a good pun in a headline. And they can take a long time to come up with, and sometimes they'll be, higher up will sort of overwrite a headline when they've come up with a good pun. And that leads to Stephen's question on humor. Sorry, by the way, some puns do cause trouble as well, so sometimes they get deleted by even more senior editors when they think it's on the wrong side of the line of entertainment. Humor. Stephen asks, modern publications often use stylistic devices such as humor, wordplay, and other written flair in order to keep readers engaged. What are your thoughts on the place of humor and written flair in modern current affairs reporting and commentaries? I think that is, again, a matter of taste. I think there are contexts where plainly a pun or an entertaining headline would not be appropriate if there's been a terrible massacre or there's been a lot of deaths or it's a particularly distressing subject. And there are times when it's part of the delight of reading a paper that we can entertain as well as inform. And in some ways, we at The Economist have a little bit of latitude where we don't have to be completely po-faced. We're allowed to show to a degree our views of world leaders and situations. So we can poke fun at the most self-regarding and pompous of political leader and public figure, and that helps us to make the case when done in limited doses and in a judicious manner.
Can I mention an example from last week's paper that I really enjoyed? We speaking of puns, yes, we do. So we get some groan-worthy ones in there, but we had a lovely box in the Asia section about the return of the kind of traditional public bathhouse, and they're called a Sento. And so the headline was a return to Sento, which, not the greatest pun in the history of the world, but got you reading. And then the first sentence was a particularly nice little bit of wordplay. It said that visitors leave their clothes and their worries at the door when they visit the name of this bathhouse. And that's an old rhetorical device called jugma, which is using a word in both a figurative and a literal sense at the same time. Like the Rolling Stones, she blew my nose and then she blew my mind, where one is literal and one is idiomatic or figurative. So leave your clothes and your worries, or leave your worries and your clothes at the door, was a neat little example of that. And it was the very first sentence. And it just draws you right in. So, that sense of delight, if you're writing happily and enjoying your writing, you'll come out with one of those. You'll be like, it was pretty good. And if you're enjoying yourself, I think typically the reader is going to be more likely to enjoy themselves too.
So we're coming to the end of our hour, so I'm going to try to do some quick fire questions, and do feel free to answer as succinctly as you want or not at all. Lane, what are your pet peeves? What would you add to the style guide? Or indeed, what would you take away from the style guide?
I don't think it's in the style guide, but I would put in the rule on literally. And I know that there are people who use literally, as in my head literally exploded, who otherwise have a good command of the language. The reason I like the old use, if you might call it the literally, is because when you can use it, when you say he pulled his high hamstring and it was literally a pain in the rear end, it's so much more fun that way. So I like that use of literally so much that I don't like the other literally in response. And I would make it clear that our writers shouldn't use literally except when they mean it that way.
People ask us various questions. Top tips for a novice in writing content for digital consumption, social, LinkedIn, microblogging, and so on. I think the answer there is more of the same. Succinctness, keep it tight. If you can tell it in 140 characters, even better than 280, which is what Twitter has gone to. If you can be entertaining, that's even better. We had a headline which said, Alexa, what is God? So if you can keep it short, entertaining, and informative, all in one, even better. My pet peeves, well, this is not pet peeve, but my pet regrets. I think there are all kinds of things that will succumb to the use. We have lots of words that we consider ugly at the moment that will, I think, eventually have to yield. We don't like the word axis as a verb. We don't like prioritize or incentivize as verbs. Lots of nouns that have become verbs. I think those are becoming so common that they will have to yield, and indeed senior people in the paper will do it. Another one that will yield, I think, soon will be the use of the military to mean the armed forces. So this is an adjective that's become a noun. Again, it's been in use for a very long time, not least by armed forces themselves. You have various contortions where you have to refer to the armed forces or the military forces or the army, when often it's not just the army. So I think that will be swept at some point. Any book recommendations, Lane, that will help with writing?
Well, The Economist Style Guide, obviously. I mentioned Ben Dreyer's style book, which is a very good one. Steve Pinker's The Sense of Style. There's lots of great stuff on language itself and also on good writing, some of the stuff we've talked about today. Those are some style books that leap immediately to mind. And if you want a longer book, the Merriam-Webster's Dictionary of English Usage is good on all the rules and will sort out a lot of these disputes for you.
One more for you in particular, because you used to be an editor of Espresso. What's the secret to espresso writing? I should tell people who don't know what Espresso is. It's our daily briefing. You can see a bit of it on our homepage, and obviously subscribers and Espresso-only subscribers can see the whole thing. It arrives every day. It's changing quickly. There's lots of good stuff in it. This is where articles are no longer than 150 words. What's the secret, Lane, of writing all those little finely cut diamonds?
Yeah, compression. I mean, you learn to have a laser focus on which words can go, which words are not adding anything. From grammatical cuttables to just saying the same thing in two different, slightly different ways. You learn to really get good at editing. It's one of the best editing trainings I think you could possibly have, is to get everything into 150 words.
And the last question is from Anonymous, appropriately. Maybe it was a bot or a computer or an artificial intelligence. Have you thought about using AI to aid your writing? Well, we did try it, actually. If you look back, you will find an article written by artificial intelligence. It appeared in one of our essay contests, I think. And we fed it the archive's worth of Economist content, and it then expelled 500 or 600 words of perfectly turned copy, which sounded like The Economist, felt like The Economist, and it was complete and utter gibberish. So fortunately for us journalists, AI hasn't figured out how to write a good story. There is a function, I think, in functional journalism, digesting quarterly results and so on, and putting them out quickly on the internet for people who need to take decisions based on them. But Lane, do you think that we're in danger from AI?
No, I think you've nailed it. The really rote stuff like writing up sports scores can now be done ably by AI. If you haven't seen one of these, you should check it out. It's quite interesting. Stock market movements, quarterly reports. Those things can be digested, but nothing really interesting. And if we're ever in that place, then we're not interesting enough, because computers have not got original thoughts in their heads yet. And that's exactly what we aim to do.
Well, fortunately, it still takes humans to write for humans. Will be employed for some time yet. I want to thank Lane very much. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to find out more about upcoming Economist subscriber events, please click on the link. And on the same page, you will find recordings of previous events, including one on race in America and another on whether Brazil can survive the years of Jair Bolsonaro. See you next time.